Dr. Edward Jolie is an anthropological archaeologist with broad interests in the Native American archaeology and ethnology of the Americas. He received his doctorate in anthropology in 2014 from the University of New Mexico. We're happy to have him now here with us in Tucson as Clara Lee Tanner, Associate Curator of Ethnology at the Arizona State Museum and Associate Professor in the School of Anthropology at the U of A, University of Arizona. Much of his research has focused on the study of perishable material culture to address a wide range of anthropological questions, including those that bear on technological innovation and change, social interaction and identities, and population movement. Ed is currently in the process of reestablishing his Perishable Material Culture Laboratory at the Arizona State Museum. Dr. Jolie has authored and co-authored multiple technical reports and book chapters and peer-reviewed journal articles. Being of mixed Oglala Lakota and Hodolji Muskogee ancestry and an enrolled citizen of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma, he strives to cultivate collaborative relationships and research partnerships with Native Americans and other descendant communities. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Ed Jolie.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. I hope that this finds you all safe and healthy, and I appreciate you turning out for this talk. As Fran said, my name is Ed Jolie. I'm an archaeologist, but of course also an anthropologist, and I'm very interested in sort of broader social questions and the ways that archaeologists can allow us to approach that. And so the title of my talk is Chaco and Perishable Technologies and Regional Perspective. And my goal tonight is really to introduce you to some of the things that we've learned about ancient basketry and related crafts from Chaco Canyon and adjacent areas in the Four Corners region of the US Southwest, roughly spanning that period between about AD 850 to 1200. And I want to do this to help sort of illustrate not just what we've learned, but some of the ways that we can begin to think about discerning between social and cultural variability in the past and what implications this might have for our understanding of Chaco Canyon and what it was and how it operated, but also what sort of long-term implications that might have for us in thinking about cultural process and long-term change in human societies. I very much think that not only is Chaco Canyon an exciting place because of the landscape and the archaeology and the people that have been involved, but also because it provides us with sort of a unique case study. We've got some dramatic cultural developments in an area that even, by contemporary standards, most people think is a really desolate, inhospitable environment, yet bore witness to some really dramatic, exciting cultural transformations. And I think that we can look back on this as sort of an opportunity to think about contemporary issues and social problems in ways that we might not have before. Not that we can find all of our answers in the past. We have to, of course, look towards the future, but there are frequently things that we can learn from the past and think about ways that they might be applicable to here and now. And so I'm all for that and making anthropology and archaeology relevant. Before I get started, I am going to be showing photographs of artifacts. I want to note up front, there aren't going to be any photographs of human remains. And there are going to be no objects illustrated that are clearly or explicitly from burial or mortuary context. There are a handful of items that I show images of that come from rooms that had burials, but by my reading of the archaeological record and the information that I have, they are not burial items. They weren't strictly or clearly associated with a particular burial. I also want to point out that I don't have any plans to get too jargony or technical, something that I'm usually want to do when I talk about baskets and textiles and the like, because I get really excited and interested in the technology. But what I do want to do is convey something in broader terms for you as an audience about how archaeologists like me that work with these materials reconstruct and interpret these technologies, how we think about evaluating, assessing wider cultural and geographic affinities in order to address and get at some of these bigger anthropological questions about past human diversity. And by bigger questions, of course, I mean, how we move from artifacts or fragments of things that people made and move beyond sort of fundamental questions about how people made a living, how they lived alongside one another, to how they worked together. They were cooperative and had successful lives. Again, I think that these are things that can provide lessons and insights into how we live our lives today, how we can learn to respect one another, talk about each other's past, and contribute knowledge that I think feeds into contemporary innovation. It gives strength and sustains our resilience as individuals and communities in challenging times. So obviously, I'm emphasizing here the regional context, and I'm doing so on the one hand because we need to be able to situate ancient basketry and related perishable artifacts in its wider geographical and cultural context. We want to try to understand and interpret them, but on the other hand, it's out of necessity as well. Imperfect preservation means that we have limited material to work with, and so when we look at wider regional traditions, when we draw data from multiple archaeological sites spread out across a larger geographic area, it helps us think about big picture patterns and trends, as much as it does point out to us when something really is unique, rather than just assuming it's unique by virtue of it having escaped centuries of rot and decay. And plus, as I like to say, casting a wide net has the advantage of reminding us to pull our heads out of the dirt and be more attentive to some of the rich traditions of the more recent past and today, which can and should be seen as reflecting the endpoint or destination of cultural processes. These are our human behaviors and patterns in human behavior that are related to, the dynamic nature of human societies. And these fluid, sort of changing dynamic societies are things that we often only get a glimpse at with archaeology. And so anchoring it in the present is a really important way, I think, for us to not only enrich the way that we view the past, to humanize the way that we view the past, but also remind ourselves that, the contemporary time period, the historic bit, this is the endpoint, the destination. We are here now because of what transpired in the past. So to that end, I also hope that my talk tonight serves a little bit of a general reminder that a number of the perishable industries that you're going to see images or illustrations of, these craft technologies, these traditional technologies haven't necessarily disappeared or died with their makers. Some of these, in fact, remain today. Others have passed in and out of use in the centuries since, and others are still sort of, they're recycling. They're being rejuvenated, revitalized, and they, in many ways, are returning to us as vibrant reminders of Native peoples' ingenuity in the past, as well as the here and now. And so the data that my talk draws upon, as you see sort of illustrated here, derives largely from a lot of my collections-based museum work, working with dozens of sites spread across the Four Corners region in the last 10 to 15 years. And this includes material that I've had the privilege of examining before, during, and since my dissertation research, which provided the bulk of the opportunity to examine a lot of this. A couple of sort of caveats. Again, inferring or determining function is often problematic with archaeological materials. And sometimes we're fortunate enough to have direct indications. Either the form is very clear, that we're looking at something like a bowl or a tray, which again are sort of ubiquitous in the archaeological record. We have baskets, bowls, and trays are very useful forms, as any survey of our contemporary kitchens would illustrate. But in other cases, we have to sort of make well-supported inferences or rely on multiple lines of evidence. And so that's why I had that example here of a basket from Aztec ruin west that provided some results from residue analyses. As much as I would have liked to have sampled every basket, it just remained the case that there wasn't obvious residues on a lot of things. So to that end, there are a lot of things that I will sort of gloss over or not really address because they speak to things that we sort of take for granted, unfortunately, utilitarian form. So, lots of bowls, lots of trays of various sizes, but also we start talking about things like mats. We see mats that are used for storage or sleeping, as well as in burials. The second related caveat is sort of one of preservation. It's a caveat that the pictures I'm using are selective, and intentionally so, given the audience here before me. I want to be able to show up to some of the better preserved examples. It makes it, I think, and I hope, easier for you all to get a better handle on what things might have looked like, a little bit closer to the reality of what I saw in the museum and what maybe, if you use your imagination and squint, some of these fragmentary or damaged baskets might have looked like when they were brand new. The upshot is that, in all of these sort of circumstances where we deal with ancient perishable artifacts, baskets, textiles, nets, sandals, and the like, we're dealing with data that derive from exceptional circumstances of preservation. So they're really the rare items that preserve. And we ultimately lack a real full picture owing to these biases of preservation, but we do the best that we can with what we have. Now, certainly Chaco Canyon, I suspect, is familiar to a lot of you tuning in. It's arguably one of the more important archaeological regions in North America. And a lot has to do with the fact that there's strong cultural continuity with contemporary Native nations in the northern Southwest going back millennia. And of course, there's also monumental architecture that has become fixed in the Western American historical imagination. And of course, for Native American descendants and archaeologists too, there are these connections, these tangible linkages to history, the past, that provide a powerful testament to the dramatic cultural developments that transpired here in Chaco Canyon and other places. For the descendants of the Chacoans and those with strong cultural connections, which includes some 26 Native nations, the landscape and archaeology embodies this deep and rich history, right? We're talking about deep connections to the landscape, to the ancestors, and also underscores how sites that are no longer occupied are anything but abandoned because they remain the homes and sites of ancestors, and they oftentimes continue to receive visitors making pilgrimages and sacred visits. So I point this out to remind people and also draw awareness and recognition of these facts are part of the reason why archaeologists and descendant communities, archaeologists like Paul Reed and colleagues at Archaeology Southwest, as well as Ruth Van Dyke and Carrie Heitman and others, have been really working hard to rally support for protection of the wider Chacoan landscape from excessive and abusive natural resource extraction for energy development. It's in that wider context that means that what we say and do about the past resonates with many contemporary peoples. Archaeology does not operate in a social or cultural vacuum. Now, very much in contrast to sort of the modern landscape, you see here a slide showing some of the goodies, as my grandmother would say, some of the exotics and more local products that abound, sometimes are found in great profusion at certain sites in Chaco Canyon. And without, we could spend, as many have, a great number of hours talking about the archaeology of Chaco Canyon. And for our purposes, sort of a big picture perspective, really we're talking about some of the archaeological interest that has centered on some of the rapid construction of large communal structures in an area where only smaller settlements had existed previously. And this is all transpiring sort of in the geological blink of an eye. We're talking about on the order of a couple centuries, beginning as early as the mid AD 800s and well into the AD 1100s. We see some of these dramatic cultural transformations borne out by not only shifts in architectural and settlement patterning, but a number of other lines of evidence that suggest the development of a massive regional system, one emanating from Chaco Canyon and spreading out across the Four Corners region of the northern Southwest, something that appears to have been integrated by sort of formalized trail systems, sometimes referred to as roads, as well as the large-scale circulation of non-local trade items, things like raw materials for stone tools, as well as ceramics, and also notable Mesoamerican imports, copper bells, macaws, cacao. Population estimates are sometimes a focus of considerable debate when it comes to Chacoan archaeology. They vary widely, and depending on who you're talking to, and whether you're talking about an individual site or the entire canyon, we might be looking at a particular sort of peak of occupation, a population approaching 2,000 or 3,000 people for the entire canyon, with a resident population at some of the other sites, perhaps ranging from 70 to 100 people. Within Chaco Canyon, it's the distinctive 2 to 3 story masonry houses or structures called great houses that tend to predominate on the north side of Chaco Canyon. And their juxtaposition against these smaller but contemporaneous, seemingly farming settlements that prevail on the south side. The most famous of these great houses, Pueblo Bonito, eventually included at its peak and maximum extent, nearly 700 rooms and perhaps 4 stories. And of course, has yielded a large quantity of shell and turquoise ornaments, in addition to some of those other imports that I've mentioned. Now, between the mid-late AD 1000s and the early 1100s, archaeologists have noted the establishment of a sort of a larger community scale structure and some other elements that had become associated with the Chaco archaeological phenomena. That is to say, that phenomenon that extends beyond the core of Chaco Canyon to a number of outlying communities. And indeed, it's during this period of time in the late 1000s that archaeologists considered the area to have become the core of a regional system spanning nearly 80,000 square kilometers, an area largely that's been defined by archaeologists on the distribution of these great houses and associated small site clusters, which are often thought of and interpreted to be farming villages. And these are sometimes or more frequently referred to as outlier communities, and some 220 or so of these have been identified. So we're talking about sort of a dramatic increase in aerial extent. And it reminds us and draws our attention to the importance of being attentive to scale, not just chronological scale in the passage of time, but geographic and spatial scale. And in fact, in addition to sort of this elaborate sort of growth and proliferation of particular construction styles and non-local goods, you know, these major building episodes have strongly implied population growth. Formal trails or roads and water control systems and obvious aggregation of people in areas that are really good for farming, you know, in tandem with this increase in imported goods, all sort of lends itself to this view and interpretation that wider Chacoan society experienced some sort of dramatic shift in social and political organization. And that is to say that if we're not simply talking about something that was by the 1000s and early 1100s, a continuation of earlier social phenomenon and patterns, it was certainly a demonstrable change in magnitude. And what that brings us to is some of the contemporary explanations for how archaeologists have accounted for these dramatic developments. And the upshot is that you sort of more or less they're variable views that might present it in some senses as a continuum, with those who might propose there's a high degree of sort of centralized community organization with a high degree of social inequality, elites, some might even say kings, but there are others who might prefer to see it as more or less egalitarian, in which sort of everybody has equal opportunity or access to power, prestige, and resources. What there is sort of an emerging consensus on, however, is that ritual played a real critical role in Chacoan society, and in particular as well in the expansion of Chacoan architecture and ceramic styles throughout the wider San Juan Basin in northwestern New Mexico. Now, obviously there are implications that climatic perturbations played a role. Some researchers attribute sort of the shift that's been observed to the consequences or impacts of persistent drought that gripped the region, creating agricultural crises and diminishing faith in community ritual practice. And ultimately, this led to large-scale population movement, including considerable depopulation at Chaco Canyon and elsewhere in the San Juan Basin by the early AD 1200s. And in fact, there's evidence to support some of this in as much as growth at outlying sites like Aztec ruins, located about 80 kilometers to the north up the San Juan River, suggest a shift or resiting of the regional system's center to a more permanent water source around AD 1100, before the system appears to have reorganized or dissipated in the late 1100s. Now, against this sort of backdrop of wider vigorous debate about the role of increased social and political complexity, less attention has been given to what I argue is a more basic demographic and social question. That is a question that addresses sort of the composition and nature of the peoples that made up Chacoan, that constituted Chacoan society. And I think this has been all the more remarkable in research on Chaco over the years, because as much time and energy and ink has been spilled addressing questions about social and political complexity in Chaco Canyon, there hasn't been as much suggestions of people paying greater attention to the composition of Chacoan society, which is to say, there's been previous research over the last century that has either explicitly or implicitly suggested the possibility of multiple social or culturally or biologically distinct groups, both within the canyon and across the regional system. And in fact, there's evidence that comes from multiple sort of data sets that provide suggestive tantalizing clues to population variation at the scale of individual archaeological sites. Certainly, perhaps within the canyon, with some people early on seizing on that dichotomy in size between the large great houses on the north side of the canyon and the smaller sites located on the south side of the canyon, is perhaps reflecting some sort of social or cultural difference. And this plays out, of course, in big picture, larger scale architectural differences across Chaco Canyon and the regional system. Of course, what I think ends up being more compelling is when we find a convergence of multiple lines of evidence. And again, there are other data that come from not just the architecture, but ceramics, studies of biological remains that provide some compelling evidence. But there's also, people tend to forget, I think, or overlook or neglect the fact that there's good historic evidence, precedent for us to be thinking about why the social and cultural and biological composition of Chacoan community within the canyon should have been something that people should have paid a lot more attention to, or have been asking more questions about. And I think that largely boils down to some of the compelling evidence for very clear social and cultural diversity operating at different geographic scales in the historic or recent American Southwest. And I think these are some of the best arguments that sort of force us to think about diversity and its impacts in archaeological settings. Obviously, language is not the same as culture or biology. That is to say, as anthropologists often have, language and culture are not isomorphic. They're not equivalent or exist as in a one-to-one relationship with each other. So we get variability in one that might not be reflected in another domain. Linguistic unity or similarity between populations doesn't necessarily equate to biological or cultural similarity, and vice versa. And so when we start thinking about this and recognizing the diversity that we can note in contemporary populations, we then start to be thinking about, well, how can we get at some of this? What can we use as sort of an indirect indicator or proxy? And again, as much as linguistic diversity doesn't correlate automatically with culture or biology, it works on a rough scale as some measure or indicator of a degree of cultural diversity. That is to say that it can give us sort of a rough clue as to what a sociocultural landscape might have been like before contact with Europeans. And obviously on a larger scale in North America, we're dealing with more than 300 Native American languages at contact, and these themselves can be grouped into what linguists identify as almost 30 major language families. And so these are families, classification of languages based on similarities between those languages, vocabularies and grammars that also tell us something about historical relationships between these populations. And when we zero in on the American Southwest, or even narrow down further to the Four Corners region in the US Southwest, we are struck by the considerable degree of linguistic diversity that's documented at contact with Europeans. And so that simple fact that we see in a relatively small geographic area considerable linguistic diversity is a pretty good indicator that we're likely needing to think more about linguistic diversity in the past. And indeed, we have ample evidence that not just comes from language, but other observations about historic Pueblo communities and other communities throughout the American Southwest. One of the more famous accounts is that of the founding of Hano, Tewa Village, as it was previously known, a Tewa language-speaking enclave at First Mesa, Hopi. This is sort of a more classic example because it's so well documented in the historical documents and literature because it was relatively recent. But there are other examples of the movement of particular groups, members of other Puebloan villages and communities that pick up and take residence in other settlements and other communities where they are speaking a different language. And that provides, again, sort of evidence that this type of population movement is not unheard of, that it at least until relatively recent, was not an uncommon phenomenon. And some of the interesting insights that we derive from this are not only one, that it happens, and it would imply that it's worth considering as a phenomenon in the past, but it actually sort of highlights sociocultural diversity as a characteristic of Southwestern societies, and likely it played an important role in the past as well. So, when we start thinking about the implication of this type of diversity, some of the things that we see are that not only are we dealing with small groups of people that were moving in some of these scenarios, but one of the sort of the key integrative functions of the newcomers to a particular community was the ritual knowledge, sometimes esoteric religious knowledge, ceremonial knowledge, and ceremonies themselves that the newcomers, the migrants, would be bringing with them to their new village. And once established, it was considered in many circumstances a benefit, a boon for these newcomers to have brought this ritual knowledge and ceremonialism with them. And it, understandably would help provide an integrative function to help make these community members feel more welcome. And of course, that's a simplification in as much as things aren't always as simple as they might sound. What that also underscores for us, I think, is that if we think about this in the context of Chaco Canyon, and we think about it on the level of several different sort of spatial and temporal scales, then we can be thinking about sort of diversity at the scale of individual sites. And by diversity here, what I'm talking about it is very simply sort of the coming together of groups of people from different cultural or historical or even ethno-linguistic backgrounds. So we're not really drawing a hard line in the dirt to say that this is what we mean as social and cultural diversity, because it can encompass a lot of things. It can look like a lot of different things. And really the challenge is attempting to detect and define what that might look like in the archaeological record. But the fact of the matter is we've got good historical evidence for it. And indeed, as I said before, archaeologists have previously suggested that this was a phenomenon at Chaco Canyon in the past. So if we think about Chaco Canyon as a more diverse social and cultural landscape, we think about the community that existed within Chaco Canyon on a larger scale, we're thinking about multiple different groups, different backgrounds that would have come together, perhaps speaking different languages. And this has a real world consequence in terms of the demands it places on how craft production is organized, on economics, on how labor forces are marshaled and utilized, but also from an organizational standpoint, some of the ritual and political systems, in as much as comparative examples from other societies cross cultures suggest that when you get these types of plural, or what we might think of in contemporary terms, multi-ethnic societies, you get all sorts of interesting opportunities for experimentation with alternative or different organizational and leadership strategies. And so what I think this is useful for thinking about is that quality of diversity is both a demographic quality and a social quality or social condition. We can talk about and attempt to describe diversity in the sense of a quality or state of being heterogeneous. But that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the social implications or consequences or the social processes that are attendant to living in that type of society. And we, of course, need both. But again, analytically, this is a real problem since we don't have good material evidence for diversity, right? It's not as if there's one class of material culture and an artifact type or technology that is, a complete perfect indicator of a particular population or identity group or ethnicity, and certainly one that we can approach archaeologically. And we appreciate that these types of phenomena are very dynamic. So one of the ways that archaeologists have begun to do this is to think a lot more about how we identify and track social groups at different scales in the past. And one of the ways that we do this is through material choices. And so you see here, obviously, the illustration of some historic and more recent quill basket weavers from Hopi, and the types of dynamic phenomena that we're talking about. These things are a little bit more of a moving target from a social and cultural perspective. Archaeologists and other scholars of social learning, that is studying learning in a social context, have remarked upon how much features or attributes of material culture, of craft products, ceramics, baskets, textiles, and the like, can reflect aspects of social learning and those histories of teaching and learning a craft within a particular community. And that is to say that different styles of basketry we can understand to be reflective of and indicative of the traditions in which they were produced. So consequently, what that means is that when we look at a particular craft tradition, whether it be a basket or textile or footwear, we're thinking about the manufacture of these goods as being produced through the social learning process, right? These are motor habits that come through repetitive action. These are cultural practices and observances related to the acquisition and preparation of the necessary materials. And these are things that are learned behaviors, and they are ingrained at the level of the individual. And individuals, as members of larger social groups, interact with one another to produce ultimately what archaeologists might think of these stylistic traditions. And these traditions, these patterns through time and over space, in styles of basketry or textiles, these are perpetuated over time through these pools of craft producers, these individuals who are at one time a learner, or both an active learner and a teacher. And what they do is sort of generate these networks with a degree of internal coherence and internal similarity that's largely defined by these historical relationships between the learning and teaching of this particular craft. So learning looms very large for me and a lot of other people who study material culture and are interested in looking at and making inference about social and cultural patterning in the past from material culture. And this is one of my favorite baskets encountered at the American Museum, in part because oftentimes when I stumble upon these things, it's without knowing that I'm going to find them. It's because they're often not entered as, child's basket or novice or beginner basket in a museum catalog. In this case, it was just a Hopi basket. But I knew as soon as I saw it that what we're looking at, and it was borne out by some digging in the archives, was an example of a young girl's work. And what I like about this and appreciate is some of the errors that you see in the production, whether it's the preparation of materials, the execution of the consistency in the stitch, the width of the stitches or the density of the stitches, the thickness of the coils. It's really sort of an insightful piece as well, because you notice that the very center of this basket is much more expertly executed. And that strongly suggests a degree of collaboration in the learning process for this young woman, which is not uncommon in many societies where, particularly with something like quilt basketry, where the very center or start is difficult to execute very, very well because of the combination of rigid materials and getting a tight spiral. Here it looks like perhaps a mom or grandma or aunt started the basket and then the young girl picked up and took it from there, focusing on sort of getting the mechanics down, but also incorporating aspects of the expected design layout. These items, again, because perishables tend to be rare, are likewise rare in the archaeological record. And so what you see here are some examples of some unfinished objects. Well, at least two unfinished objects. Chris Lewis's basket in the center is very much finished and sort of an expert example of the craft, as it were. The one on the right is an example from Aztec ruin, from a room dating to the 1200s. And is an unfinished ring basket, largely made as a mat that would then be sort of fit within the wooden ring or osier ring that would be the butt ends of the leaves that you see there sticking out on the sides like a fringe would be bound over to make the finished ring basket. And this piece stuck out to me again as a likely work of a learner, again, because I was attentive to some of the decisions and choices that are made when you're doing this, but also how much I struggled the first time I made it with, and still struggle with keeping elements tightly packed and with that row of twining around the edge to sort of looks like reinforce it. The lack of familiarity with the motor habits and perhaps lack of dexterity for me personally, I can and still now see very, very obviously the errors that I made in terms of doing that. And some of those same errors are reflected in that young learner's basket I saw on the right, from errors of making that twist or twining around the edge to difficulty keeping the elements packed tightly. And this obtains not just to some of these rare sites like Aztec ruin, but other examples from sites like Mesa Verde, and as I've seen later on, other examples from basket maker assemblages, even older assemblages where we get these insights. But again, what I appreciate here is that it reminds us how powerful the learning process is in governing some of the expectations that we have about how these baskets are set to be produced and understood to be produced in culturally appropriate ways. There's a visual quality to the density and fineness of the stitches, the size of the coils, but also the shapes of the baskets that kind of have to meet cultural or community-wide expectations. And these are things, again, that are strongly governed by social learning. So what I set out to do was take advantage of the, compared to a lot of regions, the large data set of organic material culture, perishable artifacts that come from a handful of Chacoan sites, and begin to ask some of these questions about social and cultural diversity. And I did this, of course, being informed largely by some of the broader models derived from prior research that suggest the evidence of a degree of social and cultural diversity at different spatial and social scales. So on the one hand, diversity that might be reflected by patterns in perishable artifact production at the scale of an individual site, but also at a larger community scale, which would be, for my purposes, the entirety of Chaco Canyon, looking for patterns within and among the sites scattered throughout Chaco Canyon, and of course at a larger regional scale. To what extent can I identify larger scale patterns that reflect sort of deeper, more widely shared histories of teaching and learning that occur at much broader regional scales, which is to say across the Chacoan regional system, and perhaps even with neighboring or adjacent areas. And so the focus, of course, as I've said, was on looking for pattern technological variability. And to do that, and largely because of a function of numbers and availability of samples, I focused very heavily on coil basketry, tool-plated matting, and tool-plated sandals. And I collected detailed metric and technological data, as much information I could get and wring out of every fragment from artifacts from over 20 sites, totaling more than 1,100 individual woven artifacts, baskets, sandals, and mats. And that doesn't include numbers of objects that I looked at, but did collect a lot of data on from other assemblages. This slide here I put up to illustrate some of the analytical challenges, but also show some of what we get by revisiting, re-examining some of these collections, particularly with an eye towards what might have been missed. This is a great photograph from George Pepper's excavations in the 1890s at Pueblo Bonito. In this particular room, you see a series of subsurface pits that were intentionally dug, into which some baskets, ceramic pots were laid, and likely ritually broken is the longstanding interpretation. The arrows here draw obviously your attention to the things of particular interest, which is to say, these white arrows showing you the location of some baskets, and hopefully those show up pretty clearly. It looks like a couple of globular storage baskets, perhaps inverted. There's a base and there's another base, and then this sort of V or triangular shaped basket on the right, which I interpret as very likely the remains of a large sort of conical shaped burden basket, something that's quite dissimilar from more recent or historic burden baskets that we see across much of the Southwest, but something that shares a lot more in common with much earlier conical burden basket forms produced by basket maker peoples and other populations. This is what it looked like when I got to it in the American Museum of Natural History. And I mention this and not because I'm pointing fingers at the American Museum. This could have been pretty much any other museum. It exposes not only the challenge of dealing with old collections or museum collections that themselves might become ancient by virtue of how long ago they were excavated, but also because, really it speaks to the effort and attention that Pepper and his colleagues and others of that era spent trying to save as much as they could. Far more people would have just noted in their notes there were a bunch of baskets, they looked nice, we couldn't save them. So in this particular scenario, I encountered multiple baskets spread across these several boxes at the American Museum. And I spent several hours sort of pulling out the large fragments and doing a lot of sorting. And what you get from the photograph is that it looks like there's maybe 3 baskets there. But by the time I was done my analysis and had sorted the baskets based on their dimensions of the stitch and coil density and the technology, identified 7 distinct baskets in that collection. And so more than likely what we're looking at is just a glimpse of what was actually recovered and what is only visible in this photograph itself. Now, obviously, there were some challenges, but in some cases, the real benefit and boon came from some of the observations I was able to make much later. And to sort of get to sort of the heart of it, after looking at all of this material and comparing lots of different measurements and patterns spatially and chronologically in different technologies and styles, there were a couple of patterns that really leapt out at me. And those are things that I kind of wanted in the time we have left sort of center in on. And when it comes to that, one of sort of the first cases was thinking about evidence for site scale, site level sociocultural diversity. Where was it that I observed patterning in the technology and style of basketry and mats and the like that might suggest different social groups, as indicated by variability in these traditions of learning and weaving? Where might these be most clearly manifest at a site like Pueblo Bonito? And I could do this at sites like Pueblo Bonito, but less so other sites because I simply had a sufficiently large sample. But it's a large site, and so you kind of have to work with larger samples, sort of aggregated samples. And so that meant that sort of my comparisons and regional patterning that I could observe were necessarily rough in terms of how I would aggregate and lump my samples and compare those quantitative data that I was working with. But in short, what I found is perhaps evidence for two, maybe even three distinct, overlapping sort of networks of shared learning that centered on largely different areas of Pueblo Bonito. Perhaps one of the more tenuous patterns was constricted to sort of the northern half. And I'm wondering if you all can see my mouse on the screen. Largely the northern half of the Pueblo, also coincident with some of the oldest rooms. There was a lot more internal similarity in the baskets from this particular area. The mats and sandals aren't as well preserved. So they were somewhat more mute on the subject, but there was some hint, some suggestion that there was sort of an east-west division in the older northern parts of the rooms. That's a little bit more tentative, something that would be require a bit more work to sort of firm up. Arguably, the strongest pattern is more or less coincident with some of the chronological variation we see in the construction, the architectural construction of Pueblo Bonito, where we have large sections of multiple rooms down here in the southeastern portion of the Pueblo that many of them were constructed after about AD 1080 based on tree ring data. And a lot of the baskets that I examined that came from these rooms differed in ways in terms of their metrics, the measurements of their stitches and coils, and the relationships between some of these variables, that it would suggest something far more significant to social and cultural diversity than simply baskets getting finer or coarser over time, sort of like what we might expect to see when people are producing a lot of baskets over the long term. But rather what we saw in the data are some indications of a preference for a certain shape and density of coils and stitches that is quite different, and in some ways the sort of the reverse of what we observe in baskets that came from the northern portion of the Pueblo. So all this is to say that probably more than anywhere else, it was in the coil baskets that we see this sort of broader division in terms of the style and technology of the baskets between coil basketry that came from the northern rooms and then some of those from the southeast, which again coincides with some larger architectural developments, which may correlate with some later developments and influxes of people into Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon more widely. That is sort of one of the best case scenarios, but again, it's based on really fragmentary data. Aztec ruin was a little bit trickier to sort of tease out because again, we're dealing with the imperfect nature of how the data are distributed at an individual site. But in this particular case at Aztec, one of the things that I observed is that, some of the earliest coil basketry, that basketry that's most associated with the early founding, argued by many to have been by colonists or migrants from Chaco Canyon. Those early baskets are strikingly similar to some of the finest wares that come from Pueblo Bonito and a few other sites throughout Chaco Canyon. So again, sort of providing another perhaps independent line of supporting evidence that you had people coming from Chaco Canyon and settling down at Aztec ruin. When we start thinking about things at a larger community scale, it becomes a little bit more challenging, in part because again, the data are too few from other sites throughout the canyon. We don't just have the large assemblies like we have a place like Pueblo Bonito and Aztec West Ruin. But cautiously, some of the variability in matting suggested local affinities with some differences, notably between big and small sites, both in terms of the differences in the technology, the types of mats that they were making, as well as some variation in the proportions of different types of weave structures. In this case, it's a type of interlacing mat with a 2-2 rhythm or weave pattern. And we see variation in that at some of these smaller sites proportionally, where it's 2-2 or 3-3. And those types of variations, again, are things that we typically expect to see within the context of sort of larger scale cultural and social differences in terms of populations and what particular groups like to produce in terms of technology, but also the relative proportions of different styles or different types of wares. So that's somewhat suggestive on a larger community scale that at least between some of the sites on the north side of Canyon, great houses, and smaller sites, there perhaps might have been some additional social and cultural differences. But again, the data were really limited. Sandals, likewise, a little bit more challenging. We see a great deal of continuity over the long term, in particular sandal styles. And we don't want to spend too much time on these, in large part because the data are largely constrained by the similarity of basic production techniques. We're dealing with a lot of very similar sandals and footwear that are made with this sort of 2-2 interval twill plating. But one of the interesting divisions that we see over time is the increasing preference, not just in Chaco Canyon sites, but also manifested Aztec ruin and some other sites, is by the 1200s, increasing interest and attention in using broadleaf yucca. And rather than using the narrowleaf yucca that prevails in a lot of the Chaco Canyon sandals, what we start seeing in the late 1100s and into the 1200s and Chaco Canyon and Aztec is preferential use of broadleaf yucca that people are splitting to make their large strips. Now, narrowleaf and broadleaf yucca have different growth habits. And so obviously that may bear on the route of acquisition, but it's also a little bit curious to me in large part because as you see here in this broadleaf yucca sandal, that chronological dimension raises some interesting questions because in a large assemblage of baskets and mats and sandals that I looked at from Mesa Verde sites in southwestern Colorado, one of the things that we see is, almost sole preference for broadleaf yucca for making these twill-plated sandals. And that's something that I see over time at Aztec ruin, when some of the other archaeological deposits take on a character that has a much stronger Mesa Verdean appearance to it. That shows up and is reflected in the shift in raw material preference, which again is sort of telling because raw materials is another one of those technical decisions and choices that's not just purely governed by availability, but also by sort of cultural preference. Now, this is also mirrored, in fact, by some of the changes we see in the quill basketry at sites like Aztec. And this begins to speak to some of these larger regional scale patterns and shifts and changes. A distinctive feature of AD 1200s era quill basketry is the incorporation at some Mesa Verde sites of decoration using turkey feather quills, the dark brown elements that you see dyed here. And in fact, some of the later 1200s era baskets from Aztec start to incorporate some of these, and there's somewhat of a shift, I would say, in design layout. We get these smaller, more finite elements that are repeated in a sparser design pattern. And so the overall character of the sandals and the basketry assemblage at sites like Aztec in the post-Chaco era changes rather markedly and takes on a stronger Mesa Verde flavor. And this doesn't just extend to the mechanics and technology or the materials, but also the forms as well. Plaques show up as quite common basketry products at Mesa Verde and are far more common in some of the deposits that come from Aztec ruin. So those types of more quotidian day-to-day objects are things that give us a lot of insight into sort of day-to-day practices that I think are revealing of some of the variability in the social and cultural composition of the communities that occupied Chaco Canyon or specific sites like Pueblo Bonito and Aztec ruins. But in other cases, we get what I tend to think of some of these more unique basketry forms. And some of these have more curious distributions, and they've got more attention in some of the literature on Chaco Canyon and other sites because they're just kind of weird and unique and interesting forms. One of these are the so-called sort of hourglass, or sometimes they're called oval or elliptical trays that are known from a number of different sites. There's a couple of dozen of these, not quite 2 dozen, known from sites throughout the northern Southwest. Several of these were found with women's burials, none of the ones you see here at Pueblo Bonito, but they were found to contain scraping tools, the deer humerized scrapers like you see in the images on the right that are from an experimental program that Carol Osborne conducted in the 60s to determine what they were used for. And ultimately, she makes a strong, persuasive argument that these were probably used for yucca fiber processing as opposed to scraping hides, as had long been assumed. So where we have sufficiently good preservation of some of these objects, we find tools associated with women's craft production, women's work, in essence, yucca fiber production, awls related to basketry production. And the flip side is, as we also get examples of some of these types of baskets associated in contexts where they contain objects that would readily identify them as medicine baskets or bundles, things that are not necessarily explicitly related to women's work, like particular tools or raw materials, but things that are related to ritual or ceremonial work, as it were. And some of those, such as the medicine basket from Animal House, contained a host of rocks and minerals and bits of string and other plant matter. In other cases, we found evidence. One had gone unidentified in the Magician's Barrow from Ridge Ruin in northeastern Arizona. And my ability and privilege to examine that before it was returned to descendant communities, identified one that had been used to store pigments and house pigments. So these are a type of basket form which is really unique and gets interesting attention because they're sort of an interesting, unique form, but which are far more widespread. And indeed, if we look more broadly, we find sort of similar versions of medicine and work baskets spread throughout the American Southwest down in northern Mexico, and there are even similar baskets from Andean South America, albeit done in a different form. Other types of baskets that crop up and show up in the archaeology of Pueblo Bonito and Aztec Ruin and a few other sites are these very curious coiled baskets that were coated with thin layers of red clay of uncertain origin. And a lot of these are painted with dynamic geometric designs. These first appear in the archaeological record of Pueblo Bonito and suggest that they're there in the 1000s. But by the 1100s, they're showing up at sites like Aztec Ruin. And outside that, certainly by the 1200s and 1300s, we have an increase in their numbers from areas spanning from near modern-day Acoma and Flagstaff to even later in time in the 1200s and 1300s, the Tonto and Phoenix basins of Arizona. The context suggests these are probably strongly, very richly associated, ceremonially associated baskets. Some of the other contexts for their recovery, when we have good data, suggest that we're getting things that are both coming from kivas, ritual architecture, but also associated with forms and painted decoration that implies sort of a non-utilitarian application or use. Like many other ceramic ladles, this particular basketry one from Aztec Ruin actually has a rattle handle, like some ceramic ladles. So the implication here is, and despite the lack of strong residues that might indicate a functional application, the context of recovery and the special sort of production nature of this suggests that they were very important objects. This is arguably the best preserved example that I've encountered, one which comes from the Auction Museum in the American West but has very poor collection information. This is a really dynamic design. I had some neutron activation analysis performed on a sample of the clay, and it fits geochemically with a lot of other of the clays that I was able to sample and sort of falls in the Four Corners region. We couldn't get anything more specific than that, but again, we've got this tradition of producing these types of baskets that shows up early at Pueblo Bonito, continues and persists at Aztec Ruin, and then by the 1200s, 1300s becomes a phenomenon that's far more widespread, but with significant alterations to the technology. It's by that point clearly emulation or copying of the idea, not necessarily the fine details of construction and fabrication. One of the other types of basketry that I don't think has gotten enough attention are some of the cylinder baskets that come from Pueblo Bonito. Depending on how you interpret what's written in some of Neil Judd's published reports, there's some variability in how you can count them, but we're looking at perhaps at least 8 to maybe a dozen of these that come from Pueblo Bonito. And obviously, and rightfully so, the really spectacular ceramic cylinder vessels used in the preparation and consumption of a cacao-based beverage loom large. But people also, are sort of not necessarily aware of the fact that there are some of these that both Pepper and Judd recovered from Pueblo Bonito. Some of them exhibit these sort of characteristic Dagoji style ceramic designs. And this one here is sort of imperfectly preserved. It is, you can still make out one of the sort of vestigial handles or lug handles that was woven into the fabric. And so these, in fact, again, come from some of these older rooms in the northern part of Pueblo Bonito, highly restricted spatially in their distribution. One of the other really kind of the final sort of unique basketry form that I want to draw attention to are the production of some of these rightly, identified unique or aberrant basket forms. They're readily recognized as burden baskets for carrying agricultural products or fuel for fires or turf or what have you. These particular examples are known from Pueblo Bonito and a handful of sites throughout northern Arizona, all the way down into Canyon de Chelly National Monument. And there's also even an example from sort of the Central Mesa Verde region. Neil Judd back in the 20s thought that they reflected the existence of an ancient women's society, a women's ritual society, celebrating fertility and abundance. And indeed, this is a symbolic association that's very, very much widespread, cross-culturally in human societies, that burden baskets and these types of forms are strongly associated with both women's productivity, economic productivity, but also their reproductive qualities. And so that associated with fertility and abundance is not surprising. But it's also manifest not only in the production of these baskets, which should have had that unique cleft base. And this one you see here is really one of the best preserved and oldest from Pueblo Bonito that had a woven in design that was then painted over with turquoise blue. We also see of roughly equivalent age a number of these effigies. There's variability in the shape and decoration that suggests there was some variability. Certain forms were preferred in certain places at certain times. But one of the interesting things and real striking things to me was when I began to look much beyond the data from Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon, where we have a large number of these, is that we kind of later on in time don't see them much else. There's sort of a gap or hiatus apparent in their distribution, which is to say we don't have any evidence for any examples of these that come from Aztec ruin, which is quite surprising given the preference and identification of the clay coated and painted baskets. We don't have any evidence for any of these other ritual basketry forms. But what we do see is spread far more commonly throughout northeastern Arizona are a persistence of some of these. A lot of these are largely thought to date to the 80 1200s that show up in a highly distinctive, highly standardized form. And you see here not just the similarity in shape and execution, but all the way down to the execution of the design and color palette. These two examples are but several of a number of these, which thought to date to the 1200s are remarkably similar. In fact, of the number of these that I've looked at, they are all so similar in their execution of design and manufacture that I'm leaning towards the notion that they might have been produced by one very small number of weavers, weavers who arguably would have been teaching and highly controlling the knowledge associated with their production. They're just they're about as close to sort of standardized basketry production in the archaeological record as I've seen. But of course, you get people that try and copy and emulate, and that's how I've interpreted this example of what might be perhaps a double cylinder basket or a bifurcated basket from a cliff dwelling in southern Colorado that resembles sort of in broad perspective that type of bifurcated basket, but unfortunately we don't have much more information from it. So obviously there's a lot going on here when it comes to basketry, and it's not just a matter of focusing on or emphasizing the utilitarian. If we think about this to step back and think again more in the context of what some of these insights I've been talking about tell us about sort of social interaction, some of these social processes, obviously we're dealing with ebb and flow to population movement and growth throughout the canyon. This is tracked in architecture and other aspects of the archaeological record. So we get good evidence to suggest that there's a degree of diversity operating, at least at the site scale at Pueblo Bonito, and arguably throughout the canyon, although the data are imperfect when it comes to the perishables. And what that gets us thinking about is how, again, over time, as population grew, that in and of itself could provide a source of tension among canyon residents. That could itself lend itself to factionalism and ultimately contribute to group visioning that leads to the creation of new settlements. But at the same time, I want to recall some of the early remarks I made about historic population movement and the coming together of groups from different backgrounds. Newcomers' ritual contributions and innovations that result from population mixing also would have and could have and likely afforded peaceful social and structural solutions to conflict. Again, where we start to see this fluorescence, this explosion of ritual basketry, again, by virtue of the chronology and number of specimens, it often comes back to Pueblo Bonito, if not Chaco Canyon more widely. These types of vessels, along with the cylinder vessels, begin to figure prominently during the 1000s. And this isn't to suggest that these were the only or primary foci of Chacoan ceremonialism. Obviously, the cylinder vessels were very, very important. But one of the things that we want to remember is that when we think more broadly about religion and ritual practices, a lot of anthropologists and scholars of comparative religions note that they have a powerful ability to bring disparate peoples together, often to pursue a common goal or set of goals. And so these observations that I've been making briefly here about the existence of this important ritual basketry don't bear directly as much on questions of social and cultural diversity as they do, I think, enhance our understanding of the role that diversity in ritual practice might have played in dividing or uniting the inhabitants of Pueblo Bonito. So I think minimally on some level, we can argue that some of the pattern distributions that we see in not just the utilitarian or day-to-day baskets, but also some of these ritual baskets, in particular, the bifurcated burden baskets and clay-coated painted baskets, reflect some of these distinctive ritual associations or sodalities. And likely their particular histories are tied to and connected to the lineages or social entities that maintain them at Pueblo Bonito and then arguably later at Aztec West. That we see overlap in some of these sites, certainly with the burden basket complex, the bifurcated burden basket complex, seems to suggest that aspects of Chacoan ritual and ceremonialism promoted community health and well-being, rain, fertility, agricultural abundance, things that were vital for ensuring the renewal of the world. And these are, of course, ritual components and foci that have been suggested by a lot of other Chaco scholars. So it's not that this is necessarily anything new, but what it does, I think, is give us a glimpse of some of that flexibility and inclusiveness that is appearing to be a hallmark of Chacoan ideas and beliefs. It's implied not just by this variation in material culture and what we see at the site scale, but also what we think of as Chaco style in terms of ceramics and architecture as we observe it across wider geographic areas, that area synonymous with the outliers and the regional system. But it's also, I think, inconsistent with what we would expect to see of an overt shared identity, something we might think of as akin to or equivalent to a contemporary ethnic identity, in which there's a shared belief in background and group affinity that's sort of requisite for maintaining that type of overt identity formation. So rather, I think that's telling in as much as we lack good, strong evidence for serious conflict and violence during the Chaco era. Overt identity claims are frequently noted by social scientists to be invoked in the context of conflict over power and authority. And so again, what we're thinking about is a broader social context on larger social and cultural scales that suggests something far more peaceful, far more integrative and arguably tolerant. And what that suggests is that you've got obviously evidence for people coming together, but also this provides an opportunity to think about what sort of linguistic plurality or how pluralism in languages could have been a much more common feature in the ancient Southwest than we might give a lot of credit for. And certainly there's growing evidence to suggest it was a feature and phenomenon in the Chacoan regional system. We might speculate on the impacts of that type of linguistic diversity, but I think what it does is help remind us of the fact that, again, when we're thinking about this from an archaeological perspective, we're dealing oftentimes with fleeting moments, and that sometimes where language variability or language diversity itself might have been the most powerful and most prominent is at that interface, that boundary and border between the interaction of newcomers and established residents. And the challenge for us looking at the Chacoan archaeological record is that in spite of advances in radiocarbon dating and tree ring dates, it's really hard for us to get that degree of that degree of fine scale chronology, where we can begin to sort of track momentary social interactions and changes. But the thing is that by that same token, in sort of broader long-term perspective, we've got ample historical cases from across the world that show a lot of society's attitudes towards diversity can persist for a long period of time, or even vacillate between the positive and the negative in the span of decades. And what's most important to think about in the context of these types of social exchanges and is that there's a lot of negotiation going on, particularly in these sort of first encounters. But also that, there's a great deal of historical rootedness to social and cultural diversity. Anthropologists and other scholars know that diverse places tend to be older and demonstrate lengthier occupations than some of those non-diverse places. So time ultimately looms large in terms of our being able to understand and apprehend what might have been going on at Chaco Canyon. It's a variable that both confounds us, but also our increased and improved resolution makes it possible for us to tease apart some of these more interesting social cultural questions. So with that, I think it's fair to say that our research is ongoing, but it remains clear that the past continues to hold relevance to us in the present, whether it be in terms of how we think about the objects and the people who live there, but more so to how we think about how the archaeology impacts us in the here and now. I'm grateful for Fran and Dr. Paul Mendes for inviting me to give this talk and speak to you all. But I want to leave you with a reminder that these baskets and mats and sandals and textiles related crafts, they can't be separated from the landscapes and the peoples that provide for them, so they can provide for us. So please keep in mind the need for us to support contemporary artists, but also those efforts geared towards protection of culturally vital landscapes. What I'll do is I'll provide links to the resources on the right in the chat so that you all can learn more. And so we express our gratitude to our colleagues and descendant communities who are fighting the good fight. Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time.
You're getting some hand clapping there. Thank you so much, Ed. That was really very interesting and very, very good for us to think a little bit broader about how people were together at Chaco and where they came from and what they did together. You've got got a couple of comments about how fantastic it was, getting lots of that, but I'm going to give you a couple of questions. Did you want your presentation to stay up, or? There you go. Okay, so I do have a couple of questions already, and for those of you who haven't gotten your questions in yet, go ahead and put them in and we'll get to them. Have you tested the bifurcated baskets for substances that were carried in them?
That's a good question, and I'm glad you asked, because as is often the case with a lot of this, there's a lot more that I would love to have talked about or spent more time. And I could maybe at one of these days I'll do a whole talk on just the bifurcated baskets. The short answer is no residue analyses, but I have spent a lot of time scrutinizing and studying the insides of the baskets to see what, if anything, I could find. And I haven't found anything. There are a couple of baskets that appear to be bifurcated burden baskets from Antelope House in Canyon de Chelly and in Canyon del Muerto in Canyon de Chelly National Monument, which were not available for me to examine. Sound like they had prayer sticks or other objects inside of them. There are also some rock art depictions that I think display prayer sticks and other items that are associated with ritual paraphernalia. One of the things that continues to confound me, and hopefully you were able to detect it from the one of the examples of the sort of the 1200s bifurcated baskets, is all the extreme damage and wear. I mean, these were, it's less clear for the Pueblo Bonito, the early examples, but certainly the ones from the 1200s that are so highly standardized in form and technique, those, they got the living daylights beaten out of them. They were used and used hard. So, whether it was multiple times a year or once a year over the span of several decades, it's harder to know. But yeah, I wish I could give you a better answer, but I'm constantly thinking about it.
Okay. Here's just a basic question about the labeling of the sites. So why are the small sites on the south side of Chaco referred to as BC sites? And what does that stand for?
Oh man, you got me. This is probably a good interrogation of my Chaco creds. Well, my recollection, and I'd have to look this up and double check, is that when some of these sites were first labeled and identified, in the late 1890s and turn of the 20th century, the existing Smithsonian and Laboratory of Anthropology site numbering systems weren't extant; they didn't exist, and that the BC numbers are linked to that very early site numbering system. But anything beyond that, I'll defer to perhaps some of my other colleagues here who have more and deeper experience with Chaco. But I think that's the explanation.
Thanks. All right, great talk. Have you used D-stretch to see the design more clearly on that cylinder basket, and any thoughts on the cacao?
Yes. So let's see. It looks like a great question from Dr. Bellarado.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. So on the cacao, I love chocolate. I'm a big fan. I haven't tested any of the vessels for that residue. However, I did. Dr. Patricia Crown was one of my dissertation advisors, and I did manage to secure a few samples of spalls of red clay from clay-coated painted baskets from Pueblo Bonito that she ran, and they came up negative for cacao. Now, does that mean that all of them weren't used for cacao or some other type of beverage or preparation? No, it just means that the one example from Pueblo Bonito that we tested didn't yield any results. That doesn't mean they couldn't have been used for something else. So no, the other ones haven't been tested. The other confounding factor is, given how poorly preserved some of the baskets are, it's questionable about what residues or organic materials might survive. And also with a lot of the well-preserved forms, like the bifurcated basket and the cylinder basket that you saw, they're heavily coated with paraffin. That was how Neil Judd and his crew were able to extract them and preserve their form. So that would pose a challenge as well. D-stretch, I've used that with great success, most recently on basketry shields, but I have found it can work really well for bringing out designs on baskets and sandals, but not always, depending on how they've been treated. I will say that E. Keats Webb, Dr. E. Keats Webb, who is an imaging specialist at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History at their Museum Support Center, she and Gina Watkins and I spent a little bit of time a while back playing with some infrared and multispectral imaging on a couple of those baskets. And they do greatly amplify those designs, and again, just sort of confirm and make vibrant how consistent some of the designs on the cylinder baskets are with the ceramic cylinder vessels. Now that things are returning some sense of normalcy at the Smithsonian, and I bumped into Keats this past summer, I'm hopeful that maybe we can return to that and do some imaging of some of the other baskets, because I think a lot of us would be interested in the clarity of those designs.
That's great. Thank you. I don't see any more questions. Are there other questions? If there are, we'll wait just a couple of minutes. Anything else you'd like to add, Ed, that while we're seeing?
Thank you all so much for turning out, and I see a lot of friendly, familiar faces in the chat and such. So thank you guys for showing me some love, and I look forward to the chance to do this again and hopefully have some updates and other fun things to share.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ed. That was really very, very special for us. We're glad you're here in Tucson, and thank you. And we will. Those of you who put comments in the chat box, those will get sent to Ed as well after this meeting, so he'll see those as well. And thank you, and everyone out there, thanks for joining us, and have a very good evening.
Thank you all. Stay healthy. Thank you, Fran.
Thanks.